Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay, and welcome to Grant Thornton for our, I think probably our first in-person event of the year. I'm Alex Ellerton. I am a partner in the Financial Services Group at Grant Thornton, and I lead our financial services work more generally. Delighted to invite and welcome you all here today. I know this is going to be a fantastic event that everybody's really looking forward to. We are really pleased to be hosting our friends at the CISI and the Financial Services Group of Livery companies. It's 2023, so Happy New Year to you all, if it's not too late to say that already. It's also no longer 2022, which on reflection seems to have been a year of extremes and turbulence, whether you look at geopolitics, economics, or even the weather, really. But it does therefore feel like a perfect time to look forward to the next year and work out what the next 12 months are likely to bring in the world of sustainable finance. This is a subject matter that's pretty much part of every conversation that Grant Thornton's having with our clients across the breadth of financial services at the moment. I'm here only to introduce Nick in a moment. We've got an incredible list of presenters and panel members whose thoughts I'm really looking forward to hearing. So thank you to all of the panel members and presenters for joining us today and sharing your invaluable knowledge. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Nick Garnish, who is Head of Treasury, Europe, Asia and Australia at CIBC. And over to you, Nick.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. And on behalf of the Financial Services Group of Livery companies and the CISI, welcome. This is a hybrid event which will be televised, so there will be an opportunity for people to watch it afterwards, which I think is very good. We have a stellar array of panellists and participants today who I would like to thank collectively rather than individually in advance. And I know that a number of our speakers are extremely pressed for time today. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our keynote speaker, Chris Hayward, Policy Chairman of the City of London.
Thanks, Nick. Well, a very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, to all of you, and a very happy new year. Happy 2023, which I jolly well hope is better than 2022 was for UK PLC. And thank you to Grant Thornton for hosting us in this fabulous venue this afternoon. And thank you particularly to my friends in the Financial Services Group of Livery companies and CISI for inviting me to give a keynote address at the start of what I'm sure will be an absolutely fascinating set of speakers, presenters and panels. Sadly, my diary is rather intense and I have to leave you after I've spoken, but I do wish you all a most successful and enjoyable conference. And as we start this new year, it's with real pleasure to be with you today speaking on this vital issue of sustainable finance, the world in 2023. It's funny, since I became Policy Chairman of the City Corporation back in May last year, I think I've sat on more panels about sustainability and given more speeches about sustainability than almost any other topic that I get called to speak on. And I think that just demonstrates the critical global nature of this subject, the critical importance to the planet and saving the planet of sustainability. And so it's a great pleasure to do that here today. And looking back on the world in 2022, it was unquestionably a year of challenge and change. The economy struggled to cope with successive crises precipitated by Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, the post-pandemic supply chain shocks, and political upheaval just a couple of miles away from here in Westminster. Indeed, as I travel around the world in this job representing the financial and professional services sector, one of the questions I get most frequently asked is, what on earth is going on in the United Kingdom? It was a year like no other politically, for sure. And the earth, of course, continued to warm with disastrous consequences for humans and animals alike. Mass flooding devastated 33 million people in Pakistan, while the Western United States experienced severe droughts, and here the United Kingdom's average temperature passed the 10 °C threshold for the first time in recorded history. So if anybody doesn't believe there's something happening out there to the climate, these figures, these stats, what happened just in our past year, should convince you that we are facing a crisis of enormity across the globe. These aren't the records, of course, that we should be aspiring to achieve. And it's no surprise, therefore, that the Collins Dictionary's word of the year for 2022 was permacrisis. But there is, I think, a problem with defining 2022 as a permacrisis. It suggests that we are resigned to the status quo, that our problems are entrenched, and that we find ourselves in a hole so deep that it is inescapable. Now, the fact that we are here, gathered here today, discussing this topic, defies such defeatism, in my opinion. Collectively, just as humans have been the problem, so too we can be and we must be the solution. And I believe that starts with shifting the paradigm that has held sway for too long, that finance and sustainability are unrelated at best and opposing forces at their worst. The Green Horizon Summit at COP26 in Glasgow, which I attended, as indeed I attended COP in Egypt more recently, our own Net Zero Delivery Summit last May that we hosted at the Mansion House, and the launch of GFANZ showcased that finance and sustainability are connected. Green action can lie at the heart of financial services, and indeed financial services can lie at the heart of green action. Now, I realise that the 2022 provided immense challenges to the sustainable finance agenda. The war in Ukraine prompted discussions in some quarters of retrenching to outdated carbon-intensive fuel sources. Such short-termism would only saddle future generations with a planetary debt that they would struggle to repay. Together, we here, whether in the financial services livery companies, in sustainability, or in finance, must ensure that we keep our eyes fixed beyond the immediate horizon rather than looking down at our feet. And that means looking for global solutions to this global problem. Collectively, markets from London to Los Angeles, Singapore to San Francisco need better transparency, comparability, and credibility in the sustainable finance agenda. We need to position the United Kingdom as a one-stop shop, the go-to partner for countries and companies looking for capital and expertise to help them meet their sustainability goals. We need, I suggest to you today, a four-pronged approach. Firstly, we need to reduce frictions. That means strengthening UK policy and regulation with an effective and coherent sustainable finance framework. Secondly, we need to nurture innovation. More creativity in the market will create better products for green and impact finance and services from the United Kingdom. Thirdly, we need to attract capital, firms, and exports. With better products for the market, we then need the customers to ensure a greater uptake of green and impact finance and services from the UK to the world. And fourthly, we need to retain size and scale, encouraging firms to prioritise strategic skills planning to enable effective engagement with the sustainable growth markets of today and tomorrow. Allow me to give just, if I may, for a few moments, some tangible examples of the work that we at the City of London Corporation are doing in these areas and will continue to lead in 2023. The City Corporation supports the International Regulatory Strategy Group, IRSG, which is providing the joint secretariat with the International Capital Market Association for a new industry working group with a mandate from the Financial Conduct Authority, our regulator, to develop a voluntary code of conduct for ESG data and rating providers. This group met for the first time in December and it will produce a code of conduct by June of this year. A comprehensive, proportionate and globally consistent voluntary code of conduct for ESG ratings and data will help ensure the market is fit for purpose, supporting practitioners to assess risk more accurately. It is a valuable opportunity to contribute to the sustainable finance regulatory agenda, as the United Kingdom becomes only the second country in the world to develop a code of conduct for ESG ratings. The City Corporation is also harnessing the powers of its brand and reach to lead the debate on the wider challenges the net zero imperative presents. Having previously identified that the COP circuit lacked a defined midpoint, an opportunity for businesses to look both back and forward, we stepped into that void. Last year, the City Corporation hosted the inaugural Net Zero Delivery Summit together with the UK COP presidency and GFANZ. That summit, ladies and gentlemen, brought together nearly 200 international guests at Mansion House, including prominent businesses and public sector leaders in climate finance, such as Special Presidential Envoy on Climate to US, John Kerry, COP26 President Alok Sharma, and GFANZ co-chair Mark Carney. It was a glittering array of the great and good, committed and prepared to stand and talk about this critical challenge that we all face. But the format will only reach its full potential if it becomes an annual event firmly embedded in the sustainability calendar. And on the 24th of May this year, we will host our second Net Zero Delivery Summit at the Mansion House in partnership with the Egyptian COP27 presidency. This year's event is a sign of our commitment to sustainable finance and our ambition to help drive delivery forward with this new annual MOT of the Sustainable Finance Agenda. One of the personal frustrations I find is we talk a lot about sustainability. How much are we doing and how fast are we going? And my answer to both those questions is not enough and not fast enough. And this year's theme of that Net Zero Delivery Summit will be a just transition. The focus will be on delivery, promoting examples of best practice from the different subsectors of financial services in emerging markets, so that no community, no city, and no country is left behind. We will be sharing details of the live stream of this in due course, and I hope that as many of you as possible will be able to engage with us at that summit, either in person or indeed using the live stream, and we'll give you full details to make sure that you know what's happening and who's speaking. Together, our work developing regulation and leading the wider debate form a massive effort to shift our global perception and make us the go-to place for sustainable finance. The City Corporation is working to facilitate this shift because we know that sustainable finance is one of the best tools available to policymakers in the urgent race to meet climate targets. Crucially, given the precarious economic climate I mentioned at the beginning, we also understand that good growth and good regulation are two sides of the same coin, something that people who hear me say an awful lot because I really passionately believe it. And if we make sustainable finance an integral cog in the engine of our economic system, we will have more enduring, less harmful growth that is better for the bottom line and better for the planet at the same time. There's a real business case in this, as well as a moral imperative. And through the coming days, weeks, and months ahead, we know they will be immensely challenging, for it would be nothing short of naive to think otherwise. But I believe 2023, ladies and gentlemen, is a great opportunity, a chance to ensure that the road to recovery for the economy and the planet runs through the streets of the City of London. A shot to convert green soundbites of aspiration into a symphony of action, and a rare chance to convert the fear of perma-crisis into the hope of perma-change. Thank you very much.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. That was tremendous. It's great to hear about this symphony of action. It was rather wonderful to hear all these practical realities of hard business interest being brought together with the moral imperative. Really fascinating indeed. I'm sorry you can't join us for longer. The May event looks wonderful, sounds wonderful, and will be. And we very much look forward to you coming back to join us some other time soon. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you so much. Very kind. Thank you. We are now going to move furniture very briefly. Thanks, Nikki. My name is the chair mover, George Littlejohn, from the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment. I could stand here for the next half hour thanking all the people who've helped on this. Really tremendous. I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to thank you in groups. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you those who are watching the recording on CISITV and I know that many other places. Thank you very much, as ever, to our great hosts at Grant Thornton, who are extremely generous in looking after us. Thanks for all the help from the Livery, from, I think Patricia is here, who's been hugely helpful in nudging people to give us names of people who are, or get us names of people who are coming. And thank you, of course, to my great team at CISI. There is one person I would like to thank, who sadly is not here, Sir Roger Gifford. If he was here, I think we would all be giving him our immense thanks. And I'm sure Chris would join me in saying that Roger achieved so much for the green and sustainable finance movement. As I'm sure you all know him, but briefly, former Lord Mayor, now sadly gone before his time, Scotsman, international banker, former master of my company, the Worshipful Company of International Bankers. Great guy, great lover of music, which is just as important just about as sustainability, but he did great work in that all round, and we miss him enormously. About 3.5 years ago, Roger invited the senior people from about a dozen major financial professional bodies, the accountants, the actuaries, the bankers, the insurers, us, the CFA, for a meeting at his office. When I say invited, he suggested we might want to be there. And he had John Glenn, excellent man then at the Treasury, in tow. And Roger's plan was that we would all form an alliance to work together very nicely, and we'd all help out each other on sustainable finance. And walking into the meeting, I'm not a cynic, and I'm a great long-term fan of sustainability in finance and elsewhere, but walking into the meeting with the chief exec of a large accountancy body, we agreed that while getting 2 professional bodies to agree to do something was a very good thing, 3 or more, forget it, it's not going to work. But Roger, through delicate persuasion and Scottish heavyweight cajoling, made it work. And we now have a body which has got nearly, we've got 14 member institutions, nearly 1.5 million full members between us, about the same number of students at any one time, and probably the same numbers roughly in international connections. And we'll shortly be delivering some of the fruits of our work in a major research project we're just completing on knowledge and skills needed to forward some of the aims which Chris has been talking about. We'll make sure you all see copies of that. I'm going to shut up now and get our wonderful panel on the stage, because at least one of them has to rush off, probably to the same dinner that Chris is going to. But can I invite, ladies first, may I introduce Alison and Gowman first of all? I'll introduce them properly once they begin speaking. Katya, can I ask you to sit in the middle here, if that's all right? So you're near a comfortable table. And then, in no particular order, Dewi, Nick, Rashim, and George, please, come and join me. It's... why not here, yeah? So, oh, go for it. Yeah. this is a large panel, and they very kindly agreed to keep their remarks relatively short. But following on from my remarks about Roger Gifford, we're particularly delighted to have here Alderman Alison Gowman. At the same time as Roger was launching the Green Finance Education Charter, he was being hugely helped by Alison in helping set up what became the Green Finance Institute, of which Alison was deputy chairman. And she's now been, at the same time, she was setting up the Livery Climate Action Group. She spent a year until last September treading the same corridors of the Old Bailey that Chris had been in for. Actually, he served a 2-year sentence at the Old Bailey because of COVID, but Alison served as one of the 2 sheriffs of the City of London. We're delighted to have her here today, and Alison, the floor is yours to talk about the work of the Livery Climate Action Group. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much indeed, and it's great to be here, and it's great to follow on from my good colleague Chris Hayward, because he very much, as he said, is leading what the City of London Corporation is doing. And he talked very much about the more policy and financial work and the international strategic work. But what I wanted to talk about initially anyway in my short slot is to talk about some of the practical outworkings of that, because the City of London Corporation has a climate action strategy for itself. I hope some of you will have heard about it. The City Corporation, I'd like to say, are a very radical and a very sort of innovative institution. And they agreed in 2021 to set themselves a target for their own emissions to be net zero by 2027, scope 1 and 2, and it's only now 4 years away. And then all of the square mile, all of their emissions in scope 3 and in all of their supply chains by 2040. And it's that second element that was the challenge to the rest of the city, to the businesses, to the residents, to the livery companies, the churches, to actually say, well, we've got to meet that challenge by the corporation to be net zero by 2040. So it's that practical outworking that I took forward, both actually with the city churches, but also with the city livery companies, and founded, as you've heard from George, the Livery Climate Action Group. And I'm pleased to say that I think most of the livery companies I see represented in the room are all members. We actually now have 61 fully signed up members of the Livery Climate Action Group. And I'd like to think there are another 25 who I talk about as flirting with it, because they're just waiting to sign on the dotted line. And so that will be out of 110 livery companies. We're well over half, and we'll be, well over 3/4 within this year anyway. So 2023 for me is a year of consolidation of the work. Now, what do we do? We're looking at very practical things, and we're looking at practical things around what we as livery companies, as organisations can do, and that includes what our property carbon emissions are, what our own operational emissions are, but also because the livery companies are these, not peculiar, but individual, unique organisations that have a close connection or had a close connection with a trade, a profession, a craft, an organisation, a sector. So actually they've got a really good insight into what their own trade and craft and profession, all of your professional backgrounds, can do towards net zero. But I mean, I'm talking net zero, but I'm also talking sustainability and I'm talking climate. It's a wide range. I'm not going to be too restrictive, and I don't think we are tonight either. So the Livery Climate Action Group is encouraging all of those livery companies to do things. And what was great when we set ourselves up is that it was clear the livery companies were already delivering on many of those topics. The World Trade has already had lots of lectures that they were engaged with. Last year, I was pleased at the Old Bailey that the insurers livery company and the solicitors came to me and said, let's do a real proper working dinner, talking about what are the risks, what are the issues as professionals in the legal and insurance world that we should be advising on to our clients. What's our responsibility? What's our duty of care? So really getting to some very hard and difficult but interesting topics around this, which they did under the auspices both of a livery company but in their professional capacities. But of course, the livery companies include the furniture makers, and they're doing a huge amount with their furniture trade, the textile livery companies around sustainable fashion, and the water conservators around water. So there's a huge thread of work that these livery companies, with their expertise, interest, heritage and depth of knowledge can actually bring to this topic, and can then, as the financial services group of livery companies today, have brought this to a really high level of engagement in the very much wider topic of sustainable finance, which obviously is what the corporation in a sense is known for, what the Lord Mayor, the Sheriffs and the Alderman are promoting in terms of the financial centre that the city is. But if we can walk the talk as well as talk about it, then that's what I think the livery companies are very much displaying at the moment. And we're working hand in glove with businesses in the city, but with the city corporation. And that's really a scene setting, since there is at least half the room perhaps with the livery companies. I want to thank those that are here for their engagement, to encourage them to do more, just like tonight. And I know that where we as the Livery Climate Action Group, as well as growing our members, we're also growing the breadth and depth and reach of what we're doing. We put on a seminar just before Christmas about responsible offsetting. Now you might think, gosh, we didn't know how many people from the livery would turn up. 100 came online to really talk about some very in-depth and interesting areas where livery companies can work together to create a responsible offsetting program or vehicle. We're going to have further talks about heritage buildings, and particularly almshouses, and also about potentially gathering together to create power purchase agreements amongst delivery companies, but with other small and medium-sized businesses across the corporation, across the city platform. So I think there's a lot that's going on, and that when we get to the panel, I'd also like to obviously engage with that wider area on sustainable finance. But I will stop my 2 or 3 minute speech now and just say thanks again to that livery engagement so far. Thank you.
Alison, thank you. I wish you could speak for longer, because I find it both reassuring and heartening that the livery movement is going beyond what Roger Gifford wanted. He believed that bankers would save the world, but always accepted that other professions were slightly necessary as well. But bringing in the butchers, the bakers, the candlestick makers, hugely important to saving the world for our children and grandchildren. So thank you very much. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers in turn in alphabetical order of first name. So I think next on the platform is Dewi John. Dewi, very good friend, is head of research for UK and Ireland at LIPA, which is part of Refinitiv, which, as you all know, is in turn now part of London Stock Exchange Group. And we're privileged to have 2 senior representatives from LSEG on the panel tonight. But Dewi, Chris laid down some challenges for you about getting the Data Act in order. Yeah. And I know you yourself have faced up some of the challenges in the recent past year.
We will get onto that. Yeah. I spend a lot of my time. Basically, LIPA is the fund data and analytics arm of the London Stock Exchange Group. I spend a lot of my time, in fact, all my working time, looking at spreadsheets of fund data. I'm not somebody you want to get stuck in the lift with, but I am going to be brief. So to give a little bit of context of what the data tells us to start with before I talk about the nature of the data, is I looked at some global rankings for ESG assets under management a couple of days ago. Figures are still coming in for flows for last year. In terms of total net assets, the UK ranks 8th in the world. That's not bad for ESG assets, as my teachers at school used to say to me, or put on my report cards, could do better, or room for improvements. But 8th, not too shabby. Last year's fund flows for net flows of ESG ETFs and mutual funds, we ranked 14th. So that shows there's a certain lag. A little bit of context there, we're 1 place behind Saudi Arabia. I make no comment there. So it shows that there is quite a mountain to climb in terms of that ambition that Chris referred to of and the government has set as a target of becoming a global leader of sustainable finance. And I pose as a question, I'll be interested to hear both what your views as the audience are and financial practitioners and the rest of the panel is. How you balance that off in terms of the driving ESG and sustainability regulation forward. And I think that the relaxing of regulations that I think is widely perceived of what's going to be happening with, if you like, the message behind the Edinburgh reforms. I think that may pose quite a difficult balancing act. Having said that, I think what the FCA is doing is very interesting. I was looking particularly at the paper that came out. I'm not going to spend all my time talking about papers, don't worry. But the paper that came out in October on SDR and fund labeling. And I think that's quite a considerable move forward, both in terms of what the FCA was coming out with before, plus also what's happening within Europe, within SFDR. And that's putting on funds not the onus, not just saying what they're doing, but how they're going to do it, and some really quite strict, and necessarily so, metrics on demonstrating that that is what they're going to be doing. Because we see over in Europe, and there's a lot of talk about it's going to be a problem that we're not aligned with European legislation. Actually, there are difficulties with European legislation at the moment with SFDR, and there's a lot of moving of deck chairs on the EU deck. Now there's a metaphor that's rapidly going to run out of fuel. But I think you understand what I mean. There's no point in trying to replicate regulation that is itself still being tested and modified. You're running after something that's moving quite fast as well. So I think what the UK regulator is posing to the industry, and I hope it sticks its heels in this, because I think it's very interesting regulation, is something that could actually put the UK into the forefront of global ESG regulation, and could set a gold standard, and could start to group the world around us. Now I'm going to finish very briefly as being somebody who working for an organisation that provides ESG data on this issue of the FCA saying that it's going to bring data providers into its regulatory fold. And again, I think that's a positive thing. Obviously, it's nice when you're the beneficiary of that Wild West atmosphere and you can do what you want. But actually, having worked in various capacities in ESG at the moment, you hear consistently that the problem that certainly institutional investors have is lack of transparent, comparable data. And that's fed through to, the word of 2022 was permacrisis or polycrisis. It may just as well have been greenwashing. Yeah, that has to be resolved. So I think that's a welcome move on behalf of the regulator, and we're seeing that happen increasingly globally as well. The FCA is not out on its own there. What I think is necessary, though, is because ESG is has so many moving parts. Investors themselves want so many different things from it, is actually the components are fully transparent, but can be manipulated in the way that the end investor wants to achieve their investment targets in a way that's transparent and intelligible. What we don't want to happen is sort of everything gets summed up into a single metric. Your ESG rating is 32 or 47 or 96. What does that mean? It's like saying, I was wondering how the line I'm going to finish with would go down, but I'm seeing from the audience, you're all of or most of you are an age where you'll get the reference. It's like the more meaning of life is 42. Fantastic. What's the question? And actually what the data should be able to provide us is to ask those difficult, multifaceted and questions that will actually move the dial and take us forward to where we need to be. Thank you.
Thanks, Dewi. I thought for one moment Dewi was going to tell us what the question is, but not quite yet. There was an alarming survey published late last year by our friends at the Association of Investment Companies across the way, which was about how many of our wealth management members, not directly our members, but wealth management advisors in Britain, believed the numbers they were given by the funds who were trying to sell them ESG services. And the answer was a deeply alarming 1% completely trusted the figures. And that's creating a big problem of trust in our industry, which I know that Refinitiv and others are working on very hard. So we'll come back to these issues later. Mark Carney, a few months after the Green Finance Education Charter was launched, Mark Carney spoke at the Guildhall in his first big Road to COP26 speech. This is just before lockdown. And he gave us a wonderful calling card on our community, our clients, customers. that every financial decision in future, he said, must bear climate in mind. It must take climate into account. And one person who really understands that is our next speaker, George King. George, very good friend, chartered fellow of our institute. George has got an extraordinary understanding of the span of investment, ranging from pure financial investment through to philanthropy. George is involved in wealth management, knows B Corps inside out, knows how to advise clients on making appropriate impact-related investments and so on, and is deeply involved in a major philanthropy project. George, welcome.
I wouldn't have recognized me. Thank you. So I'm going to try and just put a couple of things on the table, just a couple of topics, some of which have been raised already in different forms. As Chris was talking, I was reflecting, I was actually creating a whole new paradigm for this stuff. As he was talking, this is such a new space for finance. I mean, some of us had been around for a while, recognized that the concept of values-infused allocation of capital has been around forever, but in lots of different forms. So, you know, when I was starting out, there was things like divesting from South Africa and various things, and that was about, you know, either using finance as leverage to try and create some outcome, or about, you know, expressing some moral view. A lot of, you know, original ethical investing, a lot of sort of, this is my morality, I don't believe in tobacco, we shouldn't have this. And that's been around forever, and forms of that's been around forever. And what's interesting is a whole series of relatively niche specialist investors have created this migration towards what we now call ESG, looking at these factors in a much more detailed way, understanding what we would traditionally call non-financial factors, but of course they are financial, we just weren't measuring them in a way that we would understand the financial impact. And that's sort of finally took off in two big areas, right? It took off mostly because of some very large pension funds in Europe, and because some very specialist niche areas like stranded assets and energy. And suddenly these sort of conceptual things took on a dramatically different life in terms of how people think about allocating capital, and started all of these issues about how do you label it, how do you measure it, how do you regulate it. All that stuff is where we are from there. But it's actually remarkable how fast we've gotten there, so that it is now global. And it was only a couple of years ago, I was at RBC, we were leaders in moving this ESG concept out onto the floor for advisors to have to think about and talk about and so forth. And, you know, we've gone in a matter of really a short number of years that this is de rigueur, this is the minimum, this is the table stakes. And now we're about how do we make this better, cleaner, more transparent, more tailored, et cetera. It's an incredible journey when you sit back and think about the framing around that, notwithstanding some of the challenges and opportunities that have been identified by Dewi and by Chris and others. So, I mean, some perspective here I think is helpful. Just pick up on a couple of things. First of all, FCA came up earlier. I think they're doing some, it's a difficult job, but they're doing some good things. Hopefully you notice that they've just brought in an external advisory group to advise the board of the FCA about these ESG factors. And I think that is, frankly, what we all need to be doing. I was saying this at RBC also. There's just no way, this question that came up about the trust that users of product have in the product, it's not just about the product providers getting better, it's not just about labeling and regulations getting better, the users don't understand this stuff. We don't, firms across the board, advisory firms, et cetera, the folks who are going to apply these products also don't have the internal expertise. So all of us sort of accessing and generating external resources to help us make these judgments, as well as the external factors we talked about, that is the next critical step, and you're seeing the FCA frankly do that themselves at their board level. The SFDR also came up, and that was something I wanted to touch on as well. It's, as a user, having both been on the fund side and now on the side where I advise clients and build portfolios and so forth, in the last 6 months, coming up to the January implementation of the SFDR, you've seen this huge, huge flurry of comments from providers everywhere saying, right, we've changed the category of this fund. This is now an Article 8 fund, it's an Article 9 fund. We've relaunched these funds, we've tweaked it to improve it. It is really creating focus. It's really creating a differentiation between those who are trying to be best in class, those who are trying to stay market leading, and those who are simply following because they're being dragged into this by sort of the regulatory tides. And that the difference is notable. And I think as users, it becomes really easier to pick out, you know, who you ally with as partners. And I think that concept of partnership is critical. None of us do this together, alone. We all do this in tandem. And as George said, it's a moving target. So the idea that you're going to just do this and that's your path is absurd. I've seen tons of financial companies getting a lot of backlash for setting net zero targets and not knowing what that means, and having to sort of shift and back step and so forth from it. Well, that's fine. It's a moving target. The fact that you have that conviction doesn't mean that you should then be lambasted for not knowing exactly how you're going to get there yet, because we're all figuring that piece out. Slightly more niche in sort of the advice area. This is sort of a market-based comment to share for this audience, I think. My hope, looking forward, sort of positive perspective for 2023, is that with the return of returns, I think this gets easier for more people to engage in. So with the return of interest and the availability of interest again, notwithstanding, questionable outlooks in the very short term for economic growth and so forth, equities risk assets look at long term. And so you'll have a price decrease with long-term growth still out there in some capacity. You have interest available again. Suddenly, returns are more available. And in scarcity, people are less likely to try something new. They're less likely to try something that has any kind of residual hint of a return of a sacrifice of return, even if we can debate that. But in a more robust return environment across the board, I think that will open up this year going forward an increased opportunity set for investors and advisors of investors to bring this forward even more aggressively. And the very last thing I'll say, George, is that for those of us who are in an advice role, there's also a new regulatory regime coming in place that we have to think about suitability for clients, not just risk and return and how old you are and tax and so forth, but these issues, these sort of values-based issues are being infused in that suitability concept. So I think there's a lot happening here that's really promising.
George, thank you very much indeed. I think I agree the work that the FCA and other regulators, notably ESMA, are doing on issues like greenwashing, really terrific. But the problems get deeper as people begin to think, well, we know what greenwashing is when we see it, but that's not quite a way to regulate things, so it's tricky. Let's come back to some of that later. Next on the block is Katya Gorbakiouk from London Stock Exchange, Head of Investment Funds. Chris spoke earlier about the Symphony, which is the city's work on sustainability. I remember Katya telling me once that in her childhood in then peaceful and beautiful Odessa, most children were walking around with violin cases to their lessons, and she knew that people who didn't have violin cases were pianists. So the whole city was an orchestra, which the city has become to a certain extent in terms of sustainability, working very much together, just about in tune, mostly patchy, one or two issues around greenwashing. But the work the Stock Exchange has been doing recently under your leadership on voluntary carbon markets has been really quite extraordinary. So can you lay out some of the principles behind that and what you've been doing, please?
Sure, thank you so much, George. But firstly, I would like to congratulate you on picking the right title for this, because as we're sitting today and we're talking about the world of 2023, I'm just wondering what this panel would have said a year ago when we have just finished a very robust 2021, and we were celebrating the return of the IPO markets and quite robust and promising financial markets, and then little did we know what 2022 would bring us. So amidst all this uncertainty, I think what's becoming quite clear is the opportunity to define the future of finance as a function. So amidst all the lack of clarity, one thing becomes clear is the role of finance overall, and that is the enabler of sustainable growth. But that's just the headline. So I would like to talk about what makes it beyond the headline, what makes it, a very practical kind of the direction of travel. So I think that the key direction of travel is that sustainable finance needs to become mainstream. All finance needs to be sustainable. And I think that this is the kind of the end game, but we're making substantial progress towards that. And if you look at every job description, every divisional objective, or even the purpose of the organizations that constitute the UK capital markets, you can hardly find a function or an objective or a corporate purpose that doesn't include sustainability. And we have traveled a long way, and there is something to celebrate. But because London is an international hub companies from around the world. London Stock Exchange hosts close to half of the issuers are coming from overseas. Then the outcome of that is that this spirit of sustainability, this embedding the sustainability into the kind of mainstream objective, it permeates all the corners of the international ecosystem. And this is something that's very important, because when we bring a company into the UK capital market, it doesn't only benefit from the ecosystem of like-minded companies, from the ecosystem of advisors, and it also gets support from the organizations that promote sustainability, the regulator, the organizations like the FRC with the ever robust and constantly updated stewardship code and corporate governance code, and organizations like the IR Society that promote best practice in investor communications. And so the result of this, that this sort of integrated thinking, when it becomes quite the best widely adopted best practice around the world, and that manifests itself firstly into the way reporting has converted into this sort of integrated communications, not just with investors, but the wider stakeholders. So that's one kind of main area of progress. But I think that the elephant in the room is transition finance and what it means, and what heavy emitting sectors mean in the context of the global economy, and how critical overall they continue to play in green transition. For example, the mining sector, the minerals we mine, are a key part of enabling a green transition, and yet that's one of the most polluting sectors in the world. So what is our approach as the UK capital market to these sectors? And importantly, the question needs to be asked, what's in the best interest of the wider society? And I would argue that it's not in the interest of the wider society that companies like these are driven off public markets into opaque jurisdictions where they're subject to less investor engagement and lower corporate governance standards. So conversely, it is in our best interest to keep companies on the public markets where regulation is robust and where corporate governance standards are upheld and where they are the beneficiaries of investor engagement. And I think that if there is the biggest power to unlock the potential is the power of investors. So here the finance can be act as a solution to the problem, because these are the sectors that are in most need of capital in order to transform their products, in order to transform their operating models. And they will need capital in large scale to align with their long-term objectives and with the objectives of the society. And I think one big area of progress that my fellow panelists have mentioned already is this change of what constitutes a sustainable investment, and where FCA has taken a true leadership and have introduced, to what's an important category for me is the sustainable improver, taking an unclean asset and setting some robust milestones and making sure that there is progress of converting this non-clean asset into a cleaner asset. And that's the activity that is progressed through robust asset stewardship activities that our investors are undertaking, engaging with companies increasingly in a more granular way, and not just with the sustainability departments, but all the way at the board level, and driving change not only at the company level, but across the entire sectors, and really encouraging the quest for sector-wide solutions, and also engaging with the regulators to procure the necessary support for that activity to take place. So I think that the power of engagement should never be underestimated. And if we have to kind of earmark what constitutes success in that activity, is that how much of this responsible and impact capital we can put behind high-emitting sectors to proliferate change. And then two more points I would like to leave you with is, one was already mentioned, is the innovation. And London Stock Exchange is a 300-year-old institution, but we continue to innovate. And the business that I'm leading is the investment funds business is a 150-year-old market within London Stock Exchange, so the oldest market, but it continues to innovate. And a big testament to that were the last few years when increasingly this market was giving investors liquid assets to difficult to reach assets that are keen to sustainable transition strategies in renewable energy infrastructure, in green infrastructure, in innovation across the board, assets that are on their own difficult to procure. And the latest iteration of our innovation was the carbon market, the voluntary carbon market that we have launched. And the innovative part of it was that contrary to what other exchanges in the world are doing, by facilitating just the trading part of the carbon credits, we're not doing that. We may do that in the future, but what we have decided to solve is two things. First is access to capital for projects that mitigate climate change. So nature-based solutions or technology-led solutions that may not be commercially viable on their own, but they do produce carbon credits and are of an increasing interest to investors, both institutional and corporate. So they have not had access to capital markets, but now they do through our voluntary carbon market. And the second dilemma that we try to address is supporting corporate and institutional investors, and especially corporates in high-emitting sectors on their decarbonization journeys, and helping them to address those unavoidable and residual emissions, and changing the way they procure carbon credits. So now with this solution, as opposed to just buying a credit on a secondary market where there is a lack of transparency and lack of liquidity, they can now empower a new climate mitigation project to thrive and produce carbon credits. And so that's the nature of our innovation. And the last point I want to make is what's going to make a difference, and that has also been raised, is this collaboration and engagement in its largest possible sense. So it's the engagement and the quest for sector-wide solutions that I have already mentioned, but it's engaging with a wider array of stakeholders, driven, needs to be driven by every company, and we need to win the trust and what's particularly relevant for the UK capital market of the retail investor. And this retail investor, we need to win the hearts and minds of wider stakeholders and the retail investor, and enable their understanding of what the function of finance is, and that will be a good indicator of success. And I think that actually will underpin the sustainability of finance as the industry and as the function, how well it will become a fit-for-purpose function in this world.
Katya, thank you very much. There's much to come back to here. We've got to press on a bit, but I think this is such a shining example of real solid collaboration and engagement. Katya's words, which get away from issues around divestment, dumping fossil fuel activity into private equity somewhere and hiding the problem. Really great example. Thank you. The last time I saw Nick Dunlop before this evening was on the 7th of March 2020, which sounds like we might have had a very memorable fight or something. Not a bit of it. Willis Towers Watson has very kindly hosted events for us like this over many years, and that event that evening was a talk by John Kay and Mervyn King about their book on radical uncertainty. And because of this bug that was going around, we realized that might be this was March 2020, we realized it might be the last time we could organize a physical event for a few weeks. In fact, it was the last time we organized a physical event for more than 2 years. But it was a memorable and fascinating talk. Nick is Managing Director at Willis Towers Watson, Global Client Engagement Director, has got wide experience around the world on risk and uncertainty, and is master of the Worshipful Company of Insurers. Nick, welcome. It's great to see you again, without COVID hanging over us.
Thank you very much indeed. It's wonderful to be here. The fox in the hen coop, the insurer amongst investors. Bankers may save the world, but they're not going to do it without insurance. That's absolutely sure. Insurance has a vital, mission-critical role to play in achieving any of our aims in sustainable finance, resilient structures. I may actually slightly disagree with the point that you made, because I can think for over 40 years I've worked in an industry, a reinsurance and insurance industry, that has now very successfully taken science, has turned it into methods, models, analytics that have built a global financial system that is, thank God for all of us, deeply resilient to massive catastrophic shock. And it has done that through using analytics to properly price and allocate capital. It's the global insurance system. And I think, you know, there is an awful lot within everything that I've just said, the models, the way that we do it, and the way that we viewed this, that is going to be of enormous help to everybody in this room. And one of the key things I think that is first point to note is that our industry is now starting to take all these things that we've had that has powered the back end of our business and really start to drive them at the front end to help our clients, because these are questions that are being demanded of retail customers now, and we have a lot of tools to help. You know, we're in the risk business. We like risk. A lot of people in this room actually really hate risk. So there's a great opportunity there to start off with. Risk needs to be at the very center of this whole discussion. You know, how do we quantify the risk to systems? How do we take that risk? How do we allocate ownership of that risk to people and make them responsible for it so they can then actually do something for it? And how do we do that in a transparent and orderly way? And I can only just go back to the points made about data earlier on. If I look at my own dear industry, the words Wild West were used, and by God, it's the Wild West. We certainly need some unity around how we're going to judge what's right and what's wrong. But I think risk is a very interesting and important thing to look at. I mean, we're very, the firm I work for is very, very big into the subject of transition risk analytics. And transition risk analytics fundamentally prove that things like emissions and actual transition risk are broadly non-correlated. So while everybody's heading down the path of looking at emissions, it's very important to realize that's not necessarily at all related to risk to the enterprise. And I think that's something that people need to think about. So let's put risk at the center. It's what boards are looking to talk about. I spend most of my time talking to real life customers in the real economy, and the head scratching around what are the demands being made of the financial services sector, how am I going to answer that in a uniform and thoughtful way? It's driving them crazy. So we really do owe everybody an enormous response to this. I thought I'd mention kind of, hey, what's bothering the insurance industry in this world, because, you know, we do sit at the backstop. We are at the bottom of the capital stack. It's a place we proudly inhabit, but we've got concerns about sustainable finance and risk as well, and perhaps I'd tell you kind of what they are. So I think this year, this is going to be the year of climate liability. This is going to be the year when climate liabilities start to harden into something really quite tricky for people to deal with. We're going to start to see litigation it already is around the world, coming home and forcing companies to take responsibility for their actions in ways that they perhaps haven't thought about. And we're starting to see people being held responsibility for what they've said and what they think they're going to say in their role as directors of business. So we believe that this year is the year that those things are really going to start to harden up. What does it mean to my business? Well, it is quite interesting, actually. So I can, hot off the press, for the first time this week, we had a D&O underwriter refuse a risk on the basis of their appalling sustainability record. That was it. First time. It's the first time we've seen an underwriter refuse cover based on that. My sustainability told me not to write this. I think that's a kind of interesting statement. Now, where that is not the beginning, you know, but I think it's quite interesting to see, and that was a very major household name global reinsurer. We're going to see that year of liability, and I think we're going to start to see underwriters' positions around those liabilities harden. So if you're responsible for an organization and you're making statements, or you're investing in companies that are making statements, I would really start to watch out for this hardening of liability. I think we're very concerned about reputational risk. And I think we're concerned about reputational risk to our clients because of what I've just said. And we're starting to be concerned about reputational risk to our own. I think that is an interesting thing. Some of these softer issues, not the data, are starting to drive behavior stakeholder positions are starting to drive behaviour in certain ways. So interesting times, as well as, of course, the pressure that's coming upon us from investors and from regulators. So what do we do about this? And I think it's an interesting thing. You know, the London market is a hyper-innovative market, and I think we're going to rely on the innovation of the London market to help us provide de-risking capability for some of these really interesting new innovations that are. But I think it's very, very important that we understand what the implications of that actually are. We've got really big, interesting stakes in vast amounts of really hard to abate sectors. The London market does the hard stuff. It does aviation, it does energy, it does all of these really tricky things. It lays the risk for the world stops here, and it's an enormous part of the city. And so we need to harness the innovation of the London market and start to point it firmly down the pathway of new and emerging issues, the things that are going to drive sustainability, and so we can start to lean on the system and start to affect some of this change. I think we're going to do this, and I think we'll do this in two ways. I think the first way that we're going to do it is we're really going to need to look at this issue of risk differentiation. So what are thoughtful ways that we can work together to help prove and actually help lean on our customers to help them go through a process of transition, so we don't lose control of the risk, so we don't lose these risks and this business to very unregulated, hey, we don't care markets. So we keep control of these levers, but we find sensible and thoughtful ways, methodologies to help our clients drive through transition. So that's kind of like one thing. Record of helping people understand risk quality through the way it acts, and I think in the sustainability agenda that's quite an important thing. But I think my final point is the collaboration point. In all my years in the market, and there's a lot of insurance expertise in this room right now, the one thing that actually is most frustrating is that everybody works out how they're going to do something, and they go, oh right, we better call our insurers. And then somebody goes, well, we don't do that. And everybody goes, I told you they were useless. Well, that's quite interesting because, you know, when I walk around my office, I look on the wall and I see all these amazing pictures of the extraordinary first-time innovations that the London insurance market has done. First flight of the Boeing 747, no data, all right? Just trust. First satellites, ships, everything has all been done here. This agenda is no different. It's an innovation challenge. It's only going to get done and delivered through extreme levels of collaboration because we don't understand the data. A lot of emerging technology has no data. There is no back window that you can look through to go forwards in this case. So it's going to take extreme collaboration between very inventive people to enable us to conquer this issue. So that's my last point. Let's be highly collaborative as investors and insurers. Call us when you have an idea, not when you've got it fully formed. And I think we'll all be much better off for it. So those are my points.
Nick, after that rather worrying sequence of warnings, but especially about D&O, that was nice to end on an upbeat, positive note.
It's a huge opportunity.
Great. Well, we're about to hear about... Tremendous. We're about to hear about more opportunities from Rashim. I'm just going to tell you very briefly about a bit of collaboration which we did as an institute with two other bodies, breaking the rule about three bodies not working together, but with our friends at the Chartered Insurance Institute and the Chartered Banker Institute. We launched 2 years ago with huge help from two people sitting right here, actually. Nick Garnish, whom we saw earlier, who was then chairman of our risk committee, and Neil Brown sitting behind him, who is still chairman of our bond forum. But we launched a paper with their great help and those of others on climate risk, which has been a huge success, just relaunched, end of commercial. Last but far from least, Rashim Arora. Rashim, welcome. Rashim has done some really super work here at Grant Thornton. I've been to a couple of events in this very room, one just last month, I think, looking about the overall position of sustainability and financial services. And Rashim is going to wind this bit up with a talk on challenges and opportunities. Can I just say, Alison, we're planning to finish exactly at 6:15, maybe a few minutes later, but Alison has to leave round about then. So if you have any questions for Alison, once Rashim has concluded, then please, one question allowed for Alison. Rashim, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, George. I will try my best to be as quick as I can as well. I think my colleagues on the panel have pretty much hit the nail on the head on how to make sustainable finance work. What do you really need? You need transparency, you need trust, you need transition, you need some good tools, you need data, and then you need the bankers and the insurers to solve everything. So I think the principles of sustainable finance are quite well understood. It's just a matter of plotting out that landscape and getting firms to align to a single roadmap or story. And what we've done at Grant Thornton is work with many banks, many insurers, and helping them really implement the hard stuff, whether that's SFDR or whether that's the upcoming regulations that will be helping firms out around CSRD and SDR. And I think the key point that I'm going to touch on first for 2023 is transparency and the importance of transparency. And it's primarily driven by this vast regulatory agenda around sustainable finance. In Europe, we've just suffered the pain of implementing SFDR. In the UK, the FCA have taken this sort of second mover advantage in relation to Europe by letting SFDR be implemented, by letting the cart be delivered before the horse. And when I mean that, the corporate data not being available, but asking asset managers and asset owners to disclose their funds in relation to sustainability. What the FCA have done, which I think is very smart and was also very informative, is they've consulted with the industry extremely well. But they've also got the corporates to start disclosing. So as of last year, a large number of listed corporates had to disclose under the TCFD regime in the UK. That is now increasing this year. That gives the opportunity for information to be available to asset managers, to be in a position to label their funds and use that information for analysis to determine sustainability. So what we're seeing in the UK, I think, is innovative from a regulator's perspective and will hopefully be innovative for the London market. Furthermore, what we're seeing in the US is quite different. It's quite divergent. There is a degree of anti-ESG sentiment bubbling up in certain Republican states. There was a consultation in March of last year by the SEC around climate risk disclosures. I believe the consultation response was so vast that it broke the system. They couldn't receive all the responses in time for the deadline, and they had to extend the deadline beyond October. I've been reliably informed that the SEC will propose something of a final rule in April. My expectation is it's highly likely to be litigated and may get pushed out further even more. So we're in a situation where we have a vast regulatory agenda in Europe, which is leading the pack. We have the UK innovatively following up behind. We have the US in a position which is it's a bit of a straitjacket for themselves right now. And then there's a lot of good work happening in Asia, especially at the venues, with listing requirements requiring significant disclosures and transparency, and also similar lookalike regulations around oversight of ESG data providers and labeling of certain funds. So I think the key thing with transparency to make sustainable finance work is there needs to be some international coordination and there needs to be some consistency. And the body known as the ISSB, part of the IFRS organization, are currently working with each of the regulators, along with IOSCO, to come up with some consistent standards that are comparable, that countries can implement locally to allow firms to implement consistent disclosure requirements across their businesses and across sectors. So I think the key challenge and the key takeaway for 2023 is that the regulatory agenda around sustainable finance is vast, it's broad, and it's fast-paced, and it's likely to be divergent. And what that means for international business operating in the UK, in Europe, and in the US and Asia, and looking to distribute product in those regions, is that it may well be that firms have a higher cost of compliance, they have a lot of operational rework to do, and potentially it will be a field day for the lawyers as well, in terms of contractual disclosures and pre-contractual agreements. The other point I wanted to touch on was trust, which was emphasized by all of my colleagues. And I kind of always go back to the idea of the Warren Buffett statement, which is, once the tide rolls back, you eventually see who's been swimming naked. And in this context, greenwashing will be a key item on the 2023 agenda. I think the FCA have been in a position where they have reiterated their rules around fair, clear, and not misleading. They have relabeled them as anti-ESG or anti-greenwashing rules that would apply potentially from June of 2023. The ESMA in Europe is consulting around greenwashing risks and labeling. There's the SFDR implementation, which has been fraught and challenging for a lot of firms. So I think we're now going to see the regulators' teeth in 2023, probably in the second half, to allow the market to settle around SFDR, to allow the rules to formalise in the UK. But we are definitely going to see the regulators' teeth in the context of labelling products as sustainable when maybe you can't really prove it. And the reason you can't prove it is maybe you haven't got the right data. We'll also see some focus from the SEC around greenwashing. They have a special task force around this subject. So even if legislation doesn't come in around climate disclosures in the US, we do see the SEC using existing rules to apply certain sanctions and certain penalties to firms in the context of greenwashing. So I've touched on transparency, I've touched on trust. The other point which a colleague mentioned at the beginning was very much around data. The data around ESG has been shocking for a long time. You look at a Moody's rating, you look at S&P Global rating, you look at an in-house rating, they all tell you very different things. They all look at different frameworks, they all use different criteria. So we're now in a position where the FCA is looking to suggest a code of conduct in the UK and potentially include rating agency providers or data ESG rating providers within the regulatory perimeter, which I think will take time. But the direction with the code of conduct now allows certain data providers to follow clear standards, to begin to develop consistency. Especially with the extra data that's available, I can see ESG data and digitalization being the big opportunity for 2023. Not just because there's more data available, but because now there are clear standards that firms can follow. My other points were around transition. I think my colleague spoke very eloquently around engagement, around the need to encourage just transition rather than sort of divesting and putting assets into the shadows. I think in this area, the transition conversation needs not only stewardship, but it also needs active engagement. And that active engagement can go on for only a certain period of time, because the reality is, from a climate perspective, we're doing very poorly. Our emissions are up. Our agreements around what was agreed at COP27 was just around loss and damage. It wasn't really around the reduction and rollout, phase out of fossil fuels. So there comes a point where the conversations and the engagement can happen, but we need to draw a line and begin to push further to ensure there's sufficient transition. We're already behind in the climate conversation in terms of the 1.5 degrees target. So I think a degree of acceleration around transition will be important in 2023. Whether that will be feasible is another debate. We have an election in the UK a year from now. We have an election in the US just under 2 years from now. There is a fair amount of politics that will be involved in terms of setting legislation, in terms of setting direction around transition. But I am positive about it. The UK are in a position to looking to ask firms to disclose their transition plans as part of the transition plans task force work. So it's always good to be positive about this stuff, but we also need to be conscious that there needs to be acceleration in this space. So transparency, trust, data, transition. What was the final point? And tools, yes, indeed. And I guess this touches on the data side in terms of the digitalization, the opportunity to create tool sets based on the new data that's available, based on historic information, to be able to create tool sets that allow AI to be used in a more efficient way, will allow AI to enable more efficient use of data, to understand trends, to understand sustainability themes, will be very important in 2023. And we're seeing this with the regulators. The FCA is very much at the forefront of using AI for some elements of supervision. So our anticipation is that we will see this across the industry and the growth of AI in the context of ESG data. And the final thing that I didn't mention to all of you was we've spoken about climate for most of this evening. I think for 2023, a key point to bear in mind is the social aspects. We're in a world now where the workplace has changed dramatically. It's a new normal that we will find through the course of 2023. People want to come to work 5 days a week, and other people don't want to come at all. And I think as employers, we need to be in a position to cater for that. And we also need to be able to cater for the cultural changes that arise out of hybrid working and working from home. So I think there's a huge responsibility on corporations, on employers, to take care of their staff. And you know, there's plenty of people out there writing books about mental health right now and writing blogs on mental health. And I think we're getting to a point where the employers are going to have to take more of a role in well-being and mental health in terms of the social aspects of ESG. And what that means is there's an opportunity to attract talent, there's an opportunity to retain talent, and potentially to improve ESG scores at the end of it. So I leave you with the key point around social as being a key theme for 2023 to consider.
Rashim, I think the social aspect is a good one on which to end this wonderful event. I think Alison probably has to go off very shortly indeed. So thank you to everyone for coming here. I see lots of overlap between membership here. I mean, I see a number of people wearing different hats, or more precisely, different ties. For instance, we have sitting here near the front the wonderful John Bennett, immediate past master of the Worshipful Company of International Bankers and a chartered fellow of ours. And I can see a whole range, at least a dozen people here whom I know are members of CISI and of livery companies. Can I just very briefly introduce one other person here, Tracy Begro, who joined us a few months ago as our new chief executive. Very welcome. She is there. We'll be here. We're going to carry on the conversation over drinks. Please do stay if you can. I'm conscious Alison can't. Can I thank our terrific panel of speakers again? They really have been wonderful. Much food for thought. Thank you.